Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Michelle Marius from Project Calls. I'm just about ready to start the webinar. So just thank you very much for joining us. And it is the fourth webinar that we have been doing with the Caribbean Development Bank. This is the first for 2022. We had held a series in 2020. And of course, circumstances overtook us, and now we're back. And this webinar is about doing business with the Caribbean Development Bank. For some of you who may have joined us in 2020, there have been some updates, and we are going to be exploring that with the with the CDB representatives here today. And so I'd just like to introduce Anne-Marie Warner, who is the Acting Deputy Director of the Corporate Strategy Division, Douglas Fraser, who is the Head of Procurement, and Christine Mohammed, who is the Operations Officer in the Procurement Division. And just to give you a sense as to the program outline, we're going to start with a presentation from Ms. Warner, and thereafter the Procurement Development Unit will, the Procurement Unit will speak specifically to engaging or how consultants can engage in the procurement process with the CDB. Between the main presentations, we'll just have some questions and answers. So at least if you can, please just leave your questions until the end of the presentation. And of course, please feel free to use the chat, because maybe then I might be able to interject if you're trying to make a point or ask a question that may be more useful to ask at a particular point in time if the presenter is attending to it at the moment. So thank you so much for joining us, and I will ask Ms. Warner, Anne-Marie Warner, if she can share her presentation and proceed.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. Let me see if I can share my screen. This is always a dodgy exercise.
I find it's quite easier with Zoom than, let's say, Microsoft Teams or something. So
okay,
great.
Are you seeing?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So thanks again for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me and for allowing me to share our experience in updating our strategic plan. So this is the order of the presentation. So first off, I'll take a look at the, hang on.
All right.
Okay, right. So first off, I'll take a look at the original strategic planning framework that had been approved, then discuss, why we thought it prudent to update the plan, and then speak briefly to some of the emerging or worsening challenges, speak then to the new framework with an emphasis on, what we changed, and then finally, resourcing the strategy. So, in terms of the original plan, it was approved in December 2019. We had over a year of consultation with our borrowing member countries, with our staff, with our board of directors, our board of governors. And it was set against the backdrop of the region's heightened vulnerability to exogenous shocks. Some of you might recall we were just coming off the heels of the 2017 Atlantic hurricane season, which was the most active, I think, on record. We were also still, coming off the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, and growth over the previous decade was very slow. Growth in the region was still well below that of the other small island developing states. In addition to I'm sorry, I was just hearing hearing a noise. Sorry. So in addition to the deficits that the region would have had, in our social and economic infrastructure, we were also, still highly indebted with several countries, in excess of the benchmark of 60%, of GDP. implementation capacity issues, had plagued our BMCs. And of course, as a bank, we experienced that, firsthand with disbursement rates, for some of our projects, a little bit less than what we would have anticipated. And what did all of this mean? All of this meant that the pace of human and social development in the region had slowed. And essentially, I mean, if you were to look at the Human Development Report, we would see that while the values of the index had increased, our the rankings for our board member countries had dropped, which meant that, essentially we weren't, keeping pace with the other, keeping pace with other countries. And so we adopted a framework that was based on resilience. Right. So this is the framework. This is what our strategic planning framework looked like. You can see that we had 3 broad pillars: building social resilience, building economic resilience, and building environmental resilience. And within the boxes below those headings, you would see the areas, the sectors in which we believed we could support the region based on their needs, and also based on our areas of competency and capability. And underpinning those sectors, we had digital transformation, regional cooperation and integration, gender equality, and good governance. Those were our cross-cutting themes. And underpinning all of that was building institutional resilience, and that was building a strong CDB. And in the circle, you would see our guiding principles. So delivering integrated, comprehensive development solutions. All of those were our guiding principles that we would use to anchor our strategy. And so with that, we were off to the races. We were ready to implement our strategy. And then COVID happened. The environment changed, and we felt that we needed to update it. And essentially, I mean, in the blink of an eye, we had lost over 2,000 lives. Real economic activity in the region had contracted by over 7%, returning some countries to GDP levels not seen since the mid-2000s. On the social front, we had, poverty increasing. We had pressures on our health, education, social safety net systems, all adversely impact. Governments responded by enhancing social safety net provisions and offering, stimulus packages. But between the reduction in economic activity and the increase in spending, the debt levels were approximately 12 to 14 percentage points higher. I mean, over the medium term, the forecast is favorable. But while we expect that, we'll see, some increase in GDP and so on, for 2022, is really not until maybe 2023, even into 2024, that we see, our countries beginning to return to economic growth rates that were prior, that we see our countries are returning to GDP levels that existed before the pandemic. And some of the new and worsening challenges, I just alluded to some in terms of, the worsening dynamics and the overburdened social protection systems. These are all challenges here that we, that would have been impacted in some way by the changing environment. And with respect to climate change, I mean, one of the things that we saw, was resources being, diverted. Our BMCs, had scarce resources, and we saw, persons, having to make the choice. Well, do I, put resources, towards climate change, or do I, divert these resources and put them, in some place and maybe something to address the social fallout. And of course, vaccine administration, that is still important. But these are some of the challenges that we were seeing in 2020 and into early 2021. And all of this, essentially, helped to set the stage for, why we felt that we needed an update. At the time, we also had a new vision for the bank and for the region that was developed by our new president. We had a new president, Dr. Hyginus Leon, who took office in May of 2021. And, he brought with that, he brought with his appointment a new vision for the region, and for the bank. But essentially, what we realized was that we still needed to focus very much on resilience, given the spate of exogenous shocks that the region is vulnerable to. We believe that we needed to focus, definitely still, on resilience. But we recognized that we needed to grapple with multiple shocks at the same time, because these shocks weren't happening sequentially. As a region, some of our countries, they've had to deal with the pandemic. They had to deal with a volcanic eruption and hurricanes, all pretty much at the same time. One of our BMCs, Haiti, had to deal with a pandemic, a hurricane, and an earthquake. Right? The vision proposed, I mentioned earlier that we had a new vision, and the vision proposed that we increase our efforts to build resilience by stepping up our focus on innovation and knowledge creation. And essentially what this is saying is that, innovation and creativity, we believe that innovation and creativity are key to supporting the paradigm shift, that we need to address the chronic slow growth that we have in the region. I mentioned earlier that our growth rates, are on average, below those of small island developing countries. On average, our growth rates are like, below 2%, whereas for other small island developing countries, it's 5% and over. So we feel that we need to really focus on, innovation and creativity, to break the cycle to address the chronic slow growth and break the cycle of build, destroy, and rebuild. Knowledge creation. Knowledge creation is an imperative. And I mean, the two things are related, but knowledge creation is definitely, an imperative. Within the region, we find that there is a severe lack of data, which makes it very difficult for agencies, to make decisions that are firmly grounded in evidence. And so with that, we have a proposed framework, and this slide, compares the existing with the new. And straight off the bat, you can see that we went from having 3 pillars to 5 pillars. And I would also add that it is not a wholesale, revamping of the strategic plan. It is, more or less a tweaking, and there's some areas, in which we wanted to give greater prominence. So in the old slide, we had building social resilience, building economic resilience, building environmental resilience. Within the new slide, we have social resilience, environmental resilience, production resilience, and then we also have building financial resilience and building institutional resilience. And within these two latter pillars, you would see both that we have building BMC capacity and building CDB capacity in both areas, because we recognize that, that we need to enhance capacity in both the BMCs and CDB, if we are to help the region, advance their development. And we also have the cross-cutting themes, innovation, inclusive of digitalization, RCI, gender equality, good governance, etc. And underpinning all of this is still, a strong CDB. And these are what we call our facilitators. So just going a bit further in terms of what is new or different. So under social resilience, we added the pillar of social protection. We added social protection as a corporate priority. We added social protection as a corporate priority. And we felt that this was important, because the pandemic had really increased the pressure on the country's social security systems, which had prompted governments to step in to, of course, lessen the impact on vulnerable groups. And, they had to intervene, in very direct ways, in ways that had a direct impact on the fiscal outturn. And what we're proposing to do in this case is to focus on improving the coping, adaptive, and transformative capacities within the country. So that is an area that is a priority for us that was not so explicitly contemplated in the original strategic plan. The focus on transformational education. And what has happened here is that essentially the pandemic provided us an opportunity to rethink the learning process and essentially pivot towards one that is that better supports innovation and knowledge creation. So in other words, an education system that is based more on inquiry, discovery, and problem solving. Our children are traditionally, taught by rote, but what we want to do is to encourage more dynamic and student-centered, forms of learning. And so that is an area that we're going to be focusing on over the medium to long term. And the other aspect is really, ICT. ICT is something that we've always known was very important, in education, and could be a great facilitator, in education. But I think the pandemic sort of really forced us in that direction. I mean, we really didn't have a choice. And to a large extent, we were caught on the back foot. But what we realize is that this provides us an opportunity to really, again, rethink education in terms of, the impact that ICT can play in facilitating education. And we recognize now that, the home and the community must also now be viewed as an environment for learning. It's not just happening at the school. Learning is happening more now, in the home and the community. And so these are things that we, take into consideration, that we've taken into consideration in the new strategic plan. We also took the opportunity to update our environmental resilience ambitions. We had a new DIMSOG, disaster management, strategy and operational guidelines, which essentially, discusses how we will intervene in where natural hazards have occurred. And we also updated the strategy with our new climate finance target. We have a target which is 25 to 30% of our financing, must be, dedicated or supportive of climate finance, must be targeted towards climate finance. So 25 to 30% of our financing, must be in the area of climate finance. So these were some of the things that we took the opportunity to include and incorporate in our strategic plan update. Within institutional resilience, so institutional resilience was included as was widened to include BMC, building BMC implementation capacity. So institutional resilience focuses on implementation capacity. And what we did in the old framework, that institutional resilience primarily focused on the bank, but it was widened to include the region, and the fact that we need to build our implementation capacity in both the region and in the bank if we really are to move the needle on development. And similarly, under financial resilience, that has been introduced in the framework to highlight the importance of strong financial management, again, on both the part of the bank and the BMCs, working together to achieve, sustainable and inclusive economic growth. And what this is saying is that essentially, with respect to our financial capacity, strengthening the bank's own financial capacity, what we'll be looking to do is to ensure that we can provide the appropriate funding. And what we'll be looking to do is to, where we can, try to crowd in additional concessional as well as non-concessional resources, so that we can provide, better financing for our BMCs. And of course, we also want to strengthen our, ability to generate capital internally. We want to be, we also at the same time need to be, more profitable, and manage our expenses and revenues and so on. Right. And also, engaging in more co-financing arrangements. The other thing is that we had also renamed economic resilience. We renamed it production resilience. And I mean, we had done this we felt that it more appropriately reflected what we were trying to do within the pillar, and that it really was focusing on production, rebuilding, the productive capacity of enterprises, or strengthening the productive capacity of enterprises, to be able to return to or even exceed, production levels once they had been impacted by once they've been impacted by a particular natural hazard. And one of the things that we were going to do in this area, one of the things that we have done in the framework, is to really call out more attention to economic diversification. I mean, this is something that we've sort of done. It was, is more in the background, but again, we really wanted to call out economic diversification, the fact that we need to, perhaps focus more, explicitly on that. And of course, one of the things that we're going to be doing, is trying to focus more on private sector development, and this will involve, again, a greater focus on, on strengthening the enabling environment for growth, looking to see how we can address some of the challenges that are faced by our MSMEs. And at the same time, it also recognizes that we may need to deal with, that we may need to be able to service more private sector companies. Larger companies in the private sector provide more direct lending to companies, within the private sector. And of course, that would go hand in hand with the fact that we need to also, increase our ability to attract, the concessional and non-concessional borrowing, non-concessional funding. In terms of the cross-cutting themes, we are going to increase our focus on evidence-based decision creation. And essentially our aspirations in this area are, really to become a knowledge hub for the region. We intend to be, the go-to place for development partners, for our BMCs, when they want to find information, on the region. And when we say information, I'm referring to data, I'm referring to, and as well as other knowledge products, be there research papers, be there policy briefs, we need to be, we want to be that knowledge hub, that central sort of, repository for information on the region. We're also going to step up our focus on digitalization, as I indicated, particularly within, education. I mean, digitalization is something that has, broad applications. But I mean, we've seen it firsthand, how important it is within education. And so we are going to be stepping up our focus, on digitalization. And of course, underpinning all of that is a strong CDB. What are the resource requirements? The resource requirements, we need to make sure that we are in a strong financial place to be able to, and, to do that, we're going to, as I indicated, look to see how we can crowd in resources, utilizing, leveraging the relationships that we have with our development partners, possibly, looking to see how we can, increase our retained earnings, and if need be, explore or assess the extent to which, we may need, a capital increase. In terms of the human resources, of course, if we have some very broad ambitions, and if we are to if we are to achieve these ambitions, we need to ensure that we have the appropriate human resources. And so, we would need to, to bring on board, staff that is capable of supporting our ambitions in these particular areas. And I am going to stop here because I don't want to further exceed my time. So thank you so much. And I look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. We do have a couple of questions. The first one is by Dave Kaulesa, and he asks, how can evidence-based support new innovations? It seems to go a bit contradictory. It's a bit contradictory, appreciating, of course, the context of risk management.
Sorry, can you read the question again, please?
How can evidence-based support new innovation?
Okay.
Goes a bit contradictory. So I guess you can't, he's of the view that you can't really have evidence-based support and innovation, because I guess innovation may be untested waters. But he does, so it seems a bit contradictory, but he appreciates the context within of risk management.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay. All right. So I mean, so yeah, there's no such thing, there's no such thing as a sure thing, I guess. But essentially, what we're saying is that we need to be, it is an air, how should I put it? There's always going to be some level of risk. But there's even more risk involved if you don't have, if you're not able to capture if the evidence or the data that you do have. Because what we've found is that a lot of the time there is information out there, but it is not readily available. It's not readily available. And so, you have to really, in some instances, it might be available in somebody's institutional memory. That is not what you want. You want to be able to capture all of the information, all of the data where it resides, so that you are utilizing all of the available information that you have in order to make the decision. That does not mean that you will be operating, with perfect knowledge. No, but it means that you will be at least much further along the knowledge path than where you would have been if you didn't have access to any of that information. And so, I mean, one of the things is even like, say, like in terms of data, you go to some of our larger multilateral institutions, and there might be some information there, some scant information there on one or two of the BMCs. So there, there are challenges there. One is that you don't have adequate coverage of data, so the data set is not sufficiently wide. And then even in terms of the countries that you have, all of our BMCs might not be covered, within that particular data set. And what we want to do, is to be able to bring everything together, to bring all of the information. And of course, what it will mean is that we will need to work very closely with our BMCs. It means going into countries. It means working with the national statistics offices, in countries to pull out the information. It may also mean working with the specific with other offices. It may mean working with other offices. It might mean working with health agencies, going directly to ministries of education, and pulling out the information there, pulling out the data, pulling out the research work that they would have done, and pulling it all together, so that if there is an investor or somebody, interested in doing something in the region, at least they have all of the information that is available, in the particular area that they're interested in.
Okay, then. Thank you so much. Carol, David, if you can say your question, please.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I must say it is extremely commendable that the CDB could make such a quick about turn as it relates to their planning to meet the demands of the communities. I have two, may turn out to be three questions, but so from what you have been saying, it is clear that what is required is a mental shift on all fronts. But sometimes, and to a large extent, we continue to operate within the context of the third industrial revolution, forgetting that we are smack bang in the middle of the fourth industrial revolution. So I like the concept about being a knowledge hub. My question is really whether or not, bearing in mind the pillars for any kind of digital transformation, the first one is the uplift of your IT. And I'm sitting here thinking that there may not be a need for going to various countries in the region to get data. If you create platform as a service where private, public, not-for-profit organizations can dump their data and anyone have access to it. So the question is, you said that you still have a challenge for data and it is hard to find, but I don't think so. I think the challenge may be we have not developed a tool to access the data that is out there. It is phenomenal data that is out there. My question is, I'm saying that more than once, what are the tools you intend to use to develop this knowledge hub? Beautiful idea. I just wanted to get a sense of what it is you're looking at, because the conversation which followed spoke to a traditional way of capturing it and not utilizing the technologies that are available today to allow you to do it a lot more efficiently. So what are the tools? That's my first question. My second question sat in the space of learning. And we believe in that learning sits in silos, either in the school or in the home. Do you see learning as all pervasive and could happen anywhere? And how do we use the information technology, the ICT, to facilitate or protect learners from what is available out there, bearing in mind that learning occurs anywhere? It is not confined to a silo. This is my interpretation of it, sorry. And it is, so it's not in the home alone, it is not in the school alone, it is not in the environment. What tools are you looking to support or have thought about that would assist this part of your vision? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so thanks so much for that. Yeah, so we are right now to the first question about the tools being developed to access to support the Knowledge Hub. Right now, that is actually what we are working towards. We're working towards determining the appropriate working towards determining the appropriate platform, that would allow us to do that. So for example, so we're looking at, let's say, like the cloud platform, using SharePoint, various things. But the point is well taken, and looking for that platform that would allow our BMCs, to be able to, let's say at regular intervals, to automatically update our the Knowledge Hub. That is absolutely something that is absolutely under consideration, and not just with our BMCs. We are working with other development agencies that may have, other international development agencies that may also have information. So we're setting up MOUs with them, to allow for that sharing, of information, so that once like their information is updated, it would automatically, update us. And of course, there is still, quite a large, I don't want to say large, but yeah, quite a bit of architecture, that is involved around, that would be involved around monitoring and making sure that the information is, is of a quality that we would like. But absolutely, the point is well taken, that there are platforms that will allow us, to be able to update the data, update the information, automatically. But I still do believe that we may still need to, to have more detailed or more involved conversations, with our BMCs. It may mean even, going in and, and extracting, the information. The fact of the matter is that essentially what is required, we are willing to do what is required, in order to update the information. Some information may be easily available, some may not be so easily available. And, and where it is not, we will adopt the appropriate strategy, to ensure that we could get it. But, thanks for that. Is a really good question. It's something that we've been, trying to wrap our heads around. And the other thing is, even within our institution, we do knowledge products, we do reports and so on. We also, need to make sure that there is an automaticity in our own processes, where once these things are done, these things are made, public, that they're available, for the region. So yes, there's information out there. We need to work to see, how we can make it more publicly available, and we'll adopt the appropriate strategy. You asked, I think, like, what are the tools that we would be using to support ICT and education, I think, if I understood the question correctly.
More about the comment around learning is happening more in the home than in the school. So my thinking was, learning is not siloed.
Right. So agree. Yeah. So the point, right. So exactly that. And the strategy mentions that explicitly. It mentions that explicitly in a way that the original one did not, because essentially what this is saying, what the strategy states explicitly, is that we recognize that learning is happening everywhere. So before, learning was in the schools. Even when we thought about ICT, we were thinking about ICT, within the school. But no, the ICT is now happening, in the home. Sorry, learning is happening in the home. It is happening even, at the community. There's some in some countries, where they're learning from at home. It was really happening, in a community. There are communities that has set up systems whereby, students could go in and access, and that was really their learning environment. And we recognize that intersectionality. It absolutely calls attention to that intersectionality. And so what we would be looking to do is to, in our support, see where the gaps are. So in some instances, the gaps may be in the maybe within the IT infrastructure in the school. So if that is where the gap is, well then yes, absolutely, we would need to look to see how we can help the school itself, to build up that IT, infrastructure. It may be that we may need that, some children may not have, access, might not have the appropriate devices to be able to access the content. And so in several instances, we have done that. We've actually supported we've had projects where, we actually were able to provide, tablets and laptops and so on, right? So we're trying to see, we're really looking to see, where the gaps are, where the needs are, and try to fill those gaps. Thank you.
Okay, Thank you just so much, Anne-Marie. I think we're going to just move on to the next presentation. However, Anne-Marie, there were some questions in the chat that if you can respond to via text, I would really appreciate it. It's just that I guess we're getting a little pressed for time, and I want us to move on to the next presentation, which will be led by Doug Fraser and Christine Mohammed. So Doug and Christine, over to you. And thank you again, Anne-Marie. As I said, if you can respond to some of the questions persons had in the chat, we'd greatly appreciate it.
Sure, thank you.
Thanks, Michelle, and morning, everyone. Michelle, just to confirm that you can see the presentation. I think Christine's
Yes, we
projecting.
can. Yes, we can. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Project Calls for arranging this event and for all the Project Calls membership for your attendance this morning. We recognize that our projects really rely on the private sector inputs to succeed. So it's really of mutual benefit, these types of events. And Christine and I, we were going to follow Anne-Marie's sort of more broad macro overview of the strategic direction of the bank with a little bit more information as to how the procurement arrangements work under our projects, how you can identify opportunities, how you can participate in the process, and some key things to look out for. Sorry, I think I was muted. I don't know.
We can hear you, Doug.
Oh, you can. Okay, I got I saw a message on the screen. Maybe that was Christine rather than me. So yes, we have a membership of 28 countries. As you'll see on the screen, we have 19 borrowing member countries. So these countries have the rights to receive loans and grants in accordance with our procedures. And we have 9 non-borrowing member countries. And 2 core objectives of the bank to contribute to the economic growth and development of our countries and to promote regional economic cooperation and integration. And of course, Anne-Marie has already said a lot more about the strategic direction in detail, so I'm not going to dwell on that. Christine, if we could move forward. Again, some of this has been touched on, but just broadly to speak to the sectors in which we intervene. Education and wider social development, agriculture, water and sanitation, economic infrastructure, roads, bridges, airports and ports, energy, such as particularly renewable energy and energy efficiency. We also intervene in the private sector, and we particularly focus on support to meet micro, small and medium-sized enterprises. Sometimes this is through the modality of financial intermediaries in country. And a sort of cross-cutting area is governance. So turning more specifically to procurement, our portfolio is approximately 1.5 billion, made up of loans and grants. Some of that is in the form of what we call policy-based loans, which is basically liquidity in return for policy reforms. So if we take out the policy-based loans that we have in the portfolio, it's about a 1.3 billion portfolio as we stand. And the portfolio has been growing over recent years. The other thing that's been growing is the size of projects and the size of individual contracts. We are also increasingly playing as a bank an intermediary role. So other organizations will course funding through us for on granting or on lending. Just to mention in particular, we have accreditation from the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund in terms of climate financing. And we have a considerable line with the European Investment Bank, again for climate financing, and with the American Development Bank for COVID responses and disaster resilience in the OECS. So the bulk of the procurement opportunities sit in the area of the loans and grants, which are executed by the individual countries or agencies. But as a bank, we do require some inputs in our own right, particularly in terms of consulting services. And core areas would be for sector studies and research, and also to prepare for anticipated forthcoming programs and projects. And that's really what we're going to focus on for the remainder of the presentation, the first of the two areas for procurement, the project procurement. And I think Christine is going to take us through the next couple of slides. Christine.
Thank you, Doug. Just confirming you all can hear me. Hi, everyone. I'm Christine, and I work along with Doug. So we just want to focus on the stakeholders and roles in the procurement process. This is specifically to give persons an overview of our different roles if you are now new to CDB. So we have three major categories of stakeholders. We have the Caribbean Development Bank, we have the recipient, and we have the private sector. So I just want to touch on the recipient. We keep hearing the acronym BMCs, that is the borrowing member countries. And Doug mentioned that those can be recipients of loans. We also have persons who are recipients of grants. When I say persons, sorry, let me be clear that these could be most of the times the government of our borrowing member countries. They are the recipients of these. And the private sector, which I think consists of more of us on this webinar, includes the suppliers of goods, contractors of works. I use the term generically, providers for non-consulting services, but we can also categorize those as suppliers. And we have consultants for the specialized type of consultancy services. Excuse me. So what CDB does, we have, what we do, we have a supervising officer who might be responsible for a specific project for recipient. And that supervising officer would guide the recipient with under the umbrella of our policies and procurement framework. And when the supervising officer is looking at key stages of the procurement process, excuse me, to provide what we call no objection during that procurement process, they liaise with us, the procurement policy unit. By us, I mean Doug and myself. We also have a disbursement team, and they see about the disbursement of funds to the recipient. That means that we have an advisory role when it comes to our framework. The recipient, however, is the one who conducts the actual procurement, the one who procures those in the private sector. And they are the ones who seek our approval, our prior review or no objections, to ensure that the way that they are conducting the procurement is in alignment with our procurement framework. The recipient awards and manages the contracts. And if there are any complaints from the private sector, they try as best as they can to handle those complaints. But bear in mind, Sometimes if there is a debriefing or any other complaints or something like that, where the private sector may not accept the outcome or still want to escalate their complaints, they can do so directly to us using we have on our website instructions on how to go about placing those complaints. And we also have an independent office for integrity, accountability, and compliance. But we'll touch, Doug will touch on that a bit more in this presentation. And that pretty much concludes the stakeholders and roles in our procurement process. I spoke about our framework. So our framework consists of the procurement policy and our procurement procedures. And the most recent versions are on our website. So, and you would find information from our core principles to, I was talking about even the complaints procedures. I will show you later on where you can retrieve free copies of our policy and procedures. And just quickly, this is an overview of our goal of our procurement framework. Our goal is to promote the use of best international procurement practices which deliver value for money and the highest standards of integrity in order to provide the intended development outcomes in a timely manner. And for a quick overview, we have our core principles of the framework. So, as I mentioned, value for money, economy, efficiency, integrity, equality, and fairness and transparency. Up next is the eligibility criteria, and I'll hand this over to Doug.
Thanks, Christine. So from a purely procurement perspective, as procurement professionals, our natural stance will be to have procurement open to all comers who meet the necessary criteria. But there are certain political dimensions, of course, to membership of CDB. And with membership to CDB comes the opportunity for as a country comes an opportunity for your private sector to participate in the procurement process. So the core eligibility requirement for participation is that you are an entity member country. And in definition, we have some 3 criteria that firms must meet to fulfill that country membership criteria. The firm must be headquartered in a member country. And obviously that's not just a borrowing member country, that's a member country, any of those countries we looked at earlier in the presentation. There must be more than 50% owned by member country interests, individuals or firms. And for an individual contract, not more than 50% of the contract value shall be subcontracted to entities from non-member countries. And subcontracting here, we're looking at firms, so subconsultants, subcontractors. We're not looking at the individuals who make up a particular team. In terms of individual consultants, and I suspect we have a few on this call, individual consultants need to be citizens or legal permanent residents of a member country. A few other things to note. We used to have restrictions on the eligibility of goods in that they needed to actually be produced and supplied from member countries. That was increasingly problematic with global supply chains and the actual practicalities of policing that. So we've done away with that completely. Recipient countries still have the right to build in preferences for goods produced in borrowing member countries or for contractors from borrowing member countries. But that's on a case-by-case basis, looking at what the market can provide and their specific preferences. Where we have loans or grants to private sector entities, and this is an area which we're exploring, as Anne-Marie said earlier, a little bit more at the moment, there are no restrictions on eligibility, but the bulk of our lending and grants do still go to private sector entities as we stand. We also have some limitations on state-owned enterprises. They need to be legally and financially autonomous to participate. Christian, I think I'm handing back to you.
Sure, thank you for that, Doug. So we mentioned a bit earlier about our integrity provisions, and integrity is a core procurement principle, as I would have read earlier. So we have zero tolerance when it comes to any breaches, any violations when it comes to ethics and integrity. We have an independent office, as I mentioned. It's the Independent Office of Integrity, Compliance, and Accountability. And they oversee that process in terms of if there are any violations that may have been flagged. And they would research, and it is possible for persons who might, if persons perceive any violations of such, there are multiple channels for reporting concerns to that office. We call them ICA on our website, which I will show you later. So if you are found in breach of those integrity expectations, we have grounds for exclusion in our procurement process. And these are the main categories that we investigate or cause you to be excluded from procurement processes. These include fraud, corruption, collusion, coercion, obstruction. And we work alongside with our multinational development banks, the UN, and if it is you are found on any of their sanction lists, if you've been suspended from a procurement process, you can be publicly debarred by the other multilateral development banks, or found to have been engaging in any prohibited practice, as I would have mentioned above here, you can be suspended or debarred from the process on a whole until, and for suspension, until investigations are concluded, then you may or may not be allowed to participate depending on the outcome. So integrity is really core to our framework. Okay, so we have main types of CDB supervision. Doug, shall I hand back over to you?
Sure. So I think what we want to do at this stage of the presentation is provide hopefully a little bit of reassurance to the audience as to the CDB role that Christine spoke to a little bit earlier in the procurement process. So while the procurement is owned and undertaken by the countries or recipient agencies, particularly for those contracts which are of higher risk or higher value, and this is determined on a project by project basis, CDB plays a review process throughout the procurement process up to contract award. We do have various lower risk, what are deemed lower value contracts, and for those we deploy what we call post review, whereby we won't intervene in the process up to contract award, but we will look at a sample of contracts awarded after the event to ensure that the process was appropriately followed. Christine, if you could just move us forward one slide. Thanks. And just to give you a little taste of what the bank would actually be doing, at the front end of the procurement cycle, and we'll look at this in a little bit more detail in a minute, You'll find on the bank's website a procurement plan and a general procurement notice for each project, laying out what the key opportunities are. Obviously, a particular interest to an audience such as yourselves. And then as each individual process goes through its cycle, there are key points where we will review the documentation. If there's pre-qualification or shortlisting for consulting services, we'll look at the documents that are issued and the subsequent evaluation process. The evaluation report would come into the bank for review. In turn, after that, we'd look at the draft bidding documents or request for proposal, and again, the evaluation report that follows that. It could be that there's a number of stages to the evaluation, perhaps, as with many consulting services, a technical evaluation and a financial evaluation, and after each stage, again, we would look at the report submitted from the procuring entity. Where there are negotiations, we'll also look at the draft contract, and then any material changes to that contract once it's in effect. And you can see on the slide what that might involve. So changes that are in excess of the original contract price by more than 15%, material changes to scope, schedule, and any contract suspension or termination. I think we can move forward a slide. So this is, I know we have quite a few consultants in the audience, so we've actually got a couple of slides just to speak to the flow in the typical consulting services procurement process. Looking first at consulting firms. So typically for firms, we'll be looking for the agency who's undertaking the procurement to issue a request for expression of interest. There's a standard template you'll find on the website, so you'll understand typically what it's going to look like. Those are published. At least 14 calendar days will be allowed after publication, and I'll speak about where the publication happens in a minute. 14 days after publication for you to prepare concise expressions of interest. Typically, it's a little bit longer than 14 days. That's really rather short for many of these opportunities, but that's the minimum. Those expressions of interest are evaluated, and the procuring entity will try to prepare a short list of between 3 and 6 qualified consultants. And as we said on the previous slides for prior review, the draft expressions of interest evaluation report and the draft request for proposals document will come into the bank for no objection if the contract's subject to our prior review. And then there'll be a period of at least 30 days for consultants to prepare proposals. It could be considerably longer than this, depending on the assignment in question. And then we have the public opening and the technical evaluation. And as mentioned a few minutes ago, the technical evaluation report will come into us if it's a prior review scenario. Then there will be a financial opening for all of the firms who achieved the minimum technical score defined in the request for proposals. And again, the procuring entity will undertake a financial evaluation and a combined evaluation to take into account the technical that came before and come back to us with a recommendation as to who they want to proceed to enter into into negotiations with. There may be a standstill period after the completion of the technical and financial evaluation. And a standstill period is really just where they alert all consultants that this is the firm they intend to move forward to negotiations with. And if those negotiations prove successful, then to enter into a contract with. And it provides a 10-day period for any unsuccessful consultants to seek debriefings and raise any complaints that they may have about the process. I think we can move to the next slide. So the other process flow is for consulting services provided by individual consultants. And I understand we have some in the audience today. This is a simpler process and many of you will be very familiar with it. Again, there's a request for expressions of interest, which is typically published. Expressions of interest are prepared. These are really for individuals, essentially a form of cover letter and tailored CV for the opportunity in question. And those will be evaluated. Again, a report, if it's prior review, will come into the bank, and the procuring entity will move forward with the most qualified and experienced consultant to negotiate. There's no standard CDB form of contract for individuals, so agencies use their standard forms. We do have some minimum standards we expect to see in those contracts, including the integrity provisions, which Christine did touch on earlier. So a little bit on how to establish potential opportunities. There's two sort of buckets into which this falls. One sort of early intelligence before the formal procurement process commences. And some of this you've already heard about this morning. So this is the bank as an entity, our strategic direction, our strategic plan. We also have, within the context of our engagement with each country, a country engagement strategy. And this speaks to how the bank wishes to engage over a 3 to 5 year period with that country. What are the areas in which we're going to work with that country to support them in terms of their development? Sometimes you'll find it's generally speaking about sectors. Sometimes it does get more specific and actually start talking about potential projects. It depends how fully formed it is when those discussions happen. But you'll go onto if you go onto our website, you can actually filter it by country and have a look as to what intelligence you may be able to gather from that. And of course, there's the country's own plans, strategies, and budgets. We're only one component of the financing that they are using for their projects. So that's a little bit on the early intelligence. And if we move to the next slide, we'll see a little bit more about the formal procurement process. So as I mentioned, when we have a financing agreement signed with a country, shortly after that, we will publish for each individual project a procurement plan and a general procurement notice. And you can again, these can be filtered on the website by sector, by country. And they will tell you broadly at the front end of the project, what are the key opportunities, what are the broad timings for those opportunities to actually be advertised. I think in many cases, there's certainly some optimism bias as to when these things will actually go to market. And those plans, general procurement notices, should be updated on an annual basis by the procuring entity. I'll be frank and say that is a struggle we have to get the agencies to update them in a timely fashion. And we're looking at a new automated system to try and make that a little bit more rigorous. And then for each individual opportunity as it arises and we go to market, if it's an international or regional opportunity, it will be advertised on our website and in the United Nations Development Business, and of course on project calls. But it will also be advertised nationally. And at a national level, we require that it's in an official gazette website for such opportunities, or in a national newspaper, or a mixture of those. I think we're increasingly seeing countries starting to move towards portals for that, electronic portals, online portals for those types of opportunities. And that's probably going to grow as countries move towards e-procurement solutions. If it's just a national opportunity, it's still open to anyone who wishes to participate, but the advertising will only be at the national level in terms of the mediums we just looked at. It's also interesting, I think, to look at the contract award data. Again, this can be filtered by country, by sector. You can see who's winning the contracts, in which sectors. And if you're looking for potential collaborators or sizing up the competition, it may be useful in that regard. So we will publish on our website all of the contracts that are subject to, all of the processes which are subject to CDB's no objection. And the procuring entities also have to publish on their own websites. And if it's an international or regional process, on the United Nations Development Business site. We can move forward a slide. Right, I think I'm going to hand over to Christine to actually talk a little bit about how you might want to get your hands on some of the opportunities. Obviously, Project Calls is fulfilling some of that need, but there are other modalities we can share with you as well. Christine?
Thank you, Doug. So just going to get on, oh, sorry. Excuse me. Just going to try to get onto our CariBank website. Okay. So I have the link here in the slide. Log on to caribank.org. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you how you can sign up for opportunities. So go to our procurement section, and you would find in these first 4 quadrants, Doug mentioned you can find the procurement plans, the contract award notices, specifically the general procurement notices for each project, and for specific contracts that the agencies intend to put out to the market, you can find them here. So this is what it looks like. You can filter by country, the type of role, whether it's consultancy, the sector, and even the deadline for upcoming opportunities. As you can see, we have quite a number of opportunities right now. So I encourage you to look at that part of the website. That's other procurement notices, okay? And if you keep scrolling down the other 4 quadrants, you have our policies and resources. I spoke earlier about our framework. So we have the policy and procedures. Yes, our procedures. We even have them in French, but I think most of persons on this call here are English speaking, and we have our disbursement guidelines and so on. So if you're curious to see what some of our templates look like, you can take a look at them here. Right? Okay. But I think you may want to be more concerned about our policies and procedures if you're a member of the private sector. And we have some training resources. If you have general questions, you can ask. But I want to bring you to the attention of this particular link, Register of Consultants. So you can register as a consultant. It doesn't guarantee you being selected in a specific for project. We still encourage competition, and we have it all advertised. So that's that part. And then most importantly, I'll end with this: to sign up to receive weekly email notifications about procurement opportunities. And just click sign up and just fill out these credentials, and you'll get our weekly updates, most likely every Friday. And I think that's it from me. Let me just, okay. So we spoke about this and this, and I'll hand it back over to you, Doug.
Thanks, Christine. I see that there are a few questions.
Okay.
So thanks for the questions. What I'm going to suggest, if it's okay, is we've almost finished the presentation, and then we could pick up the questions. So I have noted them, and we'll turn to those in just a moment. But just to close out on the presentation, we know the procurement process doesn't always go smoothly. We know that some of the procuring entities do have capacity challenges. and other issues in country. So we wanted to say a few words on what to do during, if you participate in the process and you have questions, queries, issues, you want to complain, or if you want to learn why you weren't successful. So just in terms of the process, as we've said throughout, the bulk of these opportunities are managed in the recipient countries or agencies. And as the owner of the procurement, questions and queries should, in the first instance, be routed to them. If you don't get a response, you like, you can come to the bank. You can escalate it, but you'll need in the first instance to raise it with the recipient of the financing. The only exception to that is if it's a issue related to integrity. And then, as Christine described earlier, we have a number of reporting mechanisms that you can use at any time if you have concerns in that regard. If you are unsuccessful, after the process has concluded, you have the right to seek a debriefing from the procuring entity. They can choose to give that debriefing in person, or perhaps in this current situation, in a online virtual meeting, or they can do it in writing. That's their choice, but they do have to give you that debriefing. That's your right as a party to the process. Complaints, we have a full complaints approach laid out in, I think it's Annex 3 of the procedures. And it explains, if you are complaining, what information you should include in your complaint, when you should complain. And again, in the first instance, unless we're talking about integrity issues, the complaint should be to the recipient of the financing. But again, it can be escalated to us at the bank. And again, this is all set out in the procedures. So those are, I think, important areas just to bear in mind when you are participating in the process. Just to finish with a couple of recommendations or points, and some of this again will be very familiar to you. There's a lot of opportunities out there with ourselves and also with other development financiers. So we would recommend you research, including that early intelligence that we spoke to, and focus where you have a competitive advantage. Now, in terms of competitive advantages, it is, I think, worth going back to the country membership of CDB. So for a typical CDB opportunity where it's CDB's resources, the competition may be far less than you would have on, say, a World Bank or Inter-American Development Bank opportunity. So when you're looking at the competition, that's one thing to bear in mind. Positioning early with procuring entities and potential partners. I mean, we spoke about the early intelligence already. The potential partners, just to say on this, we have pre-COVID organized a number of procurement fairs for Pacific countries. And we've asked the agencies that we work with to present on the opportunities that are upcoming, but we've also provided an opportunity for the private sector to sort of network and search for potential collaborators. That's something we would like to go back to when the COVID situation allows. So in the past, we did such fairs in Barbados, Belize, BVI, Jamaica, Bahamas. I think those were the main ones, but it's something we will advertise on the website. So if that's of interest, please keep yourselves please keep yourselves up to date with announcements on the website, and we would share that with project calls as well. Christine's already spoken about familiarizing yourself with the documents. I mean, the good news is that our documents are essentially harmonized with the other banks. So if you have a history of working with another bank, such as IDB, World Bank, Islamic, I don't think you're going to find many things in there which are very alien to you. Seek clarifications during the bidding process. So if you have concerns about the way a terms of reference, a way of specification, a bill of quantities and technical requirements are structured, or about the wider bidding arrangements or contract conditions, that's your opportunity to seek your clarification. I can't promise you'll get the answer you want, but we have had a number of complaints over the last few years. And when we've looked into them, the entities in questions did not seek clarifications when they had the opportunity. Seeking debriefings, we've just spoken to this, and yes, I really would encourage you to do this. I mean, my background is actually pre-CDB working in the consulting industry. So I've actually seen from the other side of the fence, if it's done properly, that this can be very useful. And finally, let us know when you do have concerns or when things are not going as they should do. Christine, I think this is the last slide. Okay, thanks everybody. That was the presentation, and I know there are some questions. Michelle, with your permission, we'll pick a few of those up.
Yes, please. I guess Dave Kaulesa had some interesting questions, and he also has his hand up. So I guess if you can, get started.
Dave, I don't know if you wanted to come in. I see your question in the chat, but maybe you want to come in as well.
Yeah, she just asked me to. Thanks, Doug. You answered the questions before. So just to follow on, I understand that you go back to the beneficiary it itself. But what if it is something that the bank responded to in terms of the evaluation of the offer? Because as you said earlier, some of them you have override on the consultant. So if in this case, what I also wanted clarification on is what's the recourse for an issue with the bank's evaluation? Thanks.
Okay. If it's a project which is executed by the country, we don't do the evaluation. That sits with the country. We will look at the evaluation report to check that the process has been followed appropriately, but we're not in a position to do a secondary evaluation. If it's a case that it's a contract that we are awarding in our own right, then certainly that's a different situation, and we would actually undertake the evaluation ourselves. So it depends on the situation, but you won't, where we're dealing with grants and loans to countries, find the bank itself doing the evaluation. What we try to do is to provide suitable resources to the agencies where they're lacking to help them with those evaluation processes. We actually set up a roster of procurement consultants a couple of years ago, and that is available under most of the projects for the countries to contract using the financing expertise to help them with that process, because we know that can be a struggle. Dave, I think you had a second part to your question as well. You were asking about, I think something on debriefing, feedback to providers.
Yes, you answered it. Sorry, when you indicated that that we have a right to it, but only to the beneficiary. I'm still stuck within the CDB process, not process itself, but where the CDB executes the evaluation and so on. But
where we execute.
Yes, where you're
Okay.
handling it holistically.
Okay, so if we're the ones doing the evaluation and we're contracting, then you would absolutely have the right to raise issues directly with us as to the outcome of that process. So that would be, obviously there's no recipient in that scenario, so you would be coming straight into us with any queries, complaints, or debriefings that you need. And those opportunities, as I think we said earlier, are primarily almost all consulting opportunities, with a very few exceptions. I hope that answers that question, Dave.
Okay, thanks.
Michelle, I see, Lisa, you had a question about whether the budget is what determines the need to open it up internationally. So I can respond to that. And actually, this is a situation that has changed somewhat in the last year. So before, we had rigid thresholds above which the countries would normally have to advertise internationally. Now we've made it a little bit more flexible, where we have indicative thresholds, which you'll find on the website. And these are subject to change, and they probably need to be reviewed and updated in the near future. But now, as I said, they're indicative. So it depends on the situation. We are putting a lot more emphasis on the planning and market intelligence phase of the project. So rather than just a mechanical, is this contract over the threshold, we have to open it up internationally. We want the procuring entities to think about the market. Who are the providers? Are they actually available in CDB member countries to start with? And if they are, how many providers are there out there? If it's a very specialized skill set, does it necessarily make sense to advertise every such opportunity? So it's a case by case. And for particularly complex or unusual requirements, we're actually going a little bit further than just having a procurement plan, which I mentioned earlier. We're asking for procurement strategies to be prepared. And these look at all of the aspects of the market, the capacity of the executing agency, previous performance, and intelligence from our database, the other banks, and what the country can glean from other sources. So I hope that answers the question, but I would say that our primary position is that we want competition as a de facto position. So wherever possible, we want to open this up and let all potential providers see the opportunity and respond appropriately.
Lisa Paul has a question again, so if you can share it, Lisa.
Yeah, not so much a question, but thanks for that response, Doug. I think that's very helpful. And I think we're beginning to see evidence of increased engagement from the bank side with the private sector of the region. So that's very encouraging. Thanks for your response.
Thanks for the question. Michelle, Betty Comby had a question on innovation. I don't know if she wants to say a little bit more about this, just to help me and Christine
Yes.
frame a response.
Yes, I would like to say more about this. My thing is, if your focus is on innovation, then it can come from anywhere. It doesn't have to come from just the CDB perspective. So I'm saying a proactive approach to innovation would be where CDB is also accepting concept notes related to projects that are aligned to their strategic direction, which is what a lot of funding agencies do.
Yeah. No, I take your point, Betty. I think it's a good point. I mean, the way we're structured, of course, is the bank is owned by the countries. So typically, in most instances, it's the countries who will actually come to us with the projects. And we have, as you're probably aware, we have a concessional window where they have, depending on the country's development status, they have so much money which can be used for grant financing, and so much which can be used for concessional loans. And we rely on the countries very much to think about how those funds should be best utilized within the broad strategic framework of CDB, as we spoke to earlier. And that's supposed to also be mapped at the country level, of course, in the country engagement strategy. So I think a lot of this innovation would ideally be led at the country level, where innovators in country have these discussions with government and come up with appropriate uses for their financing. That said, though, we do have some specific windows or programs which are based more on calls for proposals. Some of them we manage directly ourselves, some of them we contribute to. So we contribute, some of you will be very familiar with Compete Caribbean, which is actually which is day-to-day managed by IDB, but we put a lot of resources into that. And that really relies heavily on innovation proposals from the private sector. But we have other windows within the bank for the cultural and creative industries, again, which have calls for proposals. We have another window for an EU-funded project. I think it's about 8 million euros, which is a mixture of public and private, but looking to promote opportunities for export and trade facilitation within the region. So there's different aspects to this. Some are more explicit in these particular programs. Some are perhaps more indirectly driven through the borrowing member country governments themselves.
Thank you, Doug. I like the idea of the different windows you provided. Thank you.
Thanks, too.
Doug, there's a question in the chat by from Heather Barker. She does admit she jumped on the call late.
Right.
But and therefore she was just asking about the distinction between the tender opportunities for firms versus individual consultants, which you did speak to. But I think the second part of her, well, it was more statement, but I think that might be a more interesting area to explore, which is she says, oftentimes opportunities presented for individual consultants may be better suited for firms due to the breadth and depth of experience and skill or level of work required. So, yeah.
Heather, I would say amen to that. This is something that we struggle with some of the agencies in regards to. So just to be clear, we have a very clear basis for consulting services that there needs to either be a process for individuals or a process for firms, and the two should not come together because they are different animals. They have different resources and different commercial bases for competing. So that, as you say, there are some assignments which are certainly are appropriate for individuals. The scope, the inputs, and the expertise required makes sense for an individual. But we do see some agencies who seem to think that the individual consultants are superhuman and can do the work of 3 or 4 people with technical backstopping, et cetera, and then there's surprise when the individual consultants can't deliver. So it is an ongoing struggle to try and get some of the agencies to think through not just what is appropriate, but what, from a budget perspective, makes sense. What is an appropriate allocation for a particular assignment? The other challenge we sometimes get is some of the executing agencies, rather than get a firm, believe they'll get 3 or 4 individual consultants who all have terms of reference which interlink with each other, and then try to manage that. And it tends to get very, very messy and complicated. So yes, I think it comes down to the assignment in question and what the necessary activities and outcomes sought are. But Heather, it is a work in process, which what I will say actually is we're we're actually working on a guidance note for consulting services at the moment, and this is one of the aspects in which we want to focus. That guidance note is going to be available. Well, it's going to be available primarily for our procuring entities, but it will be publicly available for everybody on the website. So, given what you said, we'll make sure that gets the due prominence it deserves.
Doug, Davindra mentioned in the chat, one approach I've seen used successfully was to have an expert draw up the terms of reference and advise if an individual or firm would be more suitable. And I guess that can work. But there was also, I think, something at least I want to just ensure is highlighted and certainly to clarify, at least from the CDB perspective, because sometimes one secures the services of consultants to help to draw up, like, I guess, project documents, terms of reference, and so on. But that consultant or team cannot participate in the actual bidding process, can they, or can't they?
If it's so, just to go back to Davindra's comment, yeah, I like that suggestion. I think that makes sense. I think that's a useful way to approach it and to help with the decision making, and that's something that really we should be doing in the appraisal stage for the projects when we're looking at the different consulting assignments and deciding within the procurement plan how that should be designated. And to come back to Michelle's point, yes, I mean, if the consultant, be that a firm or an individual, is preparing inputs that basically prepare a downstream assignment, typically that will exclude them from executing that downstream assignment. Sometimes, though, we do have preparation studies which are not so much directly linked to a specific downstream opportunity, but a wider sort of preparation studies or research for the project. And in that instance, typically, I mean, it does depend on the specifics, but typically the consulting firm or individual is not necessarily going to be excluded as long as the results from their study, their research, is made available to everybody else who's participating in that other process. So I hope I haven't muddied the waters with that, Michelle.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions? And even Anne-Marie is still on the call. If there were any other questions too that one might want to direct her way, granted that she has been responding to some of the questions by the chat.
Michelle, I don't know if Anne-Marie wanted to come back in on any of her written comments at all.
Okay, yes, I guess.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I was just here, happily typing away. So, yes. So, I mean, thanks so much for the questions. Really, 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 really great questions. So, yeah, so because of the time constraints, I didn't get into, the full detail on some of the points. So for example, around crime, and I think I spoke to that one, where we're targeting, we're looking at crime by targeting the youth, focusing more on prevention, targeting youth at risk. And, the preliminary evidence, suggests that the programs have worked very well. I don't have the numbers, to hand, but initial feedback on the project is that, that the young persons, participated quite well. Some were able, to find jobs after their participation, in the programs. And so, it's really about, trying to put them on that healthier track, on that path for success. I think I was in the process of responding to, I think is Davindra, who had asked about, the innovation systems, and I think it was ISO 56001, I think. So while we didn't necessarily get into that We didn't mention that, specifically in the strat plan update. What we did was that within the discussion on promoting, economic diversification, we said that, that there's a clear link between innovation and economic diversification and so on. We really explored that. And what we did was that we utilized, in fact, Daniel Eisenberg's representation of a private sector, ecosystem, which would allow for that innovation to take place, and which would allow for that innovation to take place and to promote, the productivity and export diversification and so on that we want. And within that framework, that focuses, that captures 6 principles. Policy, ensuring that we have the appropriate policy environment. It looks at finance, ensuring that there is appropriate and that there's adequate access to capital. It looks at the culture, what are the societal norms, that would help to facilitate a more robust and dynamic private sector. It looks at the support systems, and here we're including, like infrastructure, non-governmental institutions, and so on. It also looks at the human capital that is available, skilled and unskilled labor. Where's the propensity of labor, skilled or unskilled? And it lastly captures, of course, the markets, the customers and the networks that are available. So, so we did not utilize, the ISO 56000 and so on, but we utilized Daniel Eisenberg's representation to help guide us in our deliberations and guide our strategy in that space, because we felt it was very relevant to what we were seeing, within the Caribbean and what we would need to do to support the private sector. So those are just some additional comments. I'll continue to scan the chat and see if there's anything else that I can respond to. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Anne-Marie. Just a question on my part. Oh, let me see, there seems to be another, hold on. Okay, just another question here on my part. Understanding the cross-cutting issues. So one mentions innovation, digitalization, gender, etc. How are those being fostered through the various, I guess, branches of work that the CDB is pursuing?
Yep. So essentially what happens is that for pretty much every project that we do, we look for opportunities. We look for opportunities to see how our project outcomes could be enhanced by factoring in, those considerations, or it may even be, and so we would look to see how our project outcomes could be enhanced by factoring in, those various components. And it also looks at how, if there are any potential, negative outcomes from our projects, how by factoring those, looking at those considerations could help to mitigate, any potential negative outcomes from the projects. But what I would say is that, just by way of example, in terms of gender, so we have our gender specialists, and pretty much every project, we look at these projects, through a gender lens, and specifically there is a gender marker that we attach to the various projects. So projects can be, they can be, marginally mainstreamed for gender, where gender is marginally mainstreamed in the project. It can be, gender specific, where a project might, might more explicitly, target certain gender outcomes. So it is really about assessing and analyzing, each project with the particular lens. And on that note, one of the things that we would want to do, we're focusing more on, on evidence-based, decision creation, is to really look at those projects, where data, where information, is generated, and make sure that we are able, like, to capture that information. Because a lot of the time, we do the projects and the information is generated and it's on somebody's, computer, or it's, it's in the network somewhere, but again, if we're focusing on, on that evidence-based decision making, we would want to look more aggressively, at our projects through that lens, to make sure that, to see what are the opportunities for data capture and ensure that, that we factor those into our deliberations. But yeah, essentially it means that we will be looking at these things we'll be looking at our projects through those lens. And as it relates to like regional cooperation and integration, are there opportunities there for a regional intervention? So, we might have a project may start out as an intervention for one particular country, but then through deliberations, you realize, but hey, another country is interested in that. Maybe that is something that we could, like address through a regional, intervention. So yeah, so I hope I answered the question, but it's, it means looking at projects through the various lens of the cross-cutting themes. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for that, Anne-Marie. And by chance, are there any other questions? All right, then. I mean, folks, we've been at it for a little while, so just thank you so much. I just want to thank our presenters as well, Anne-Marie Warner, Christine Mohammed, and Doug Fraser from the CDB. I'd also just like to encourage you, we have actually a follow-up webinar that's going to be happening on the 30th, where we actually will be getting into the various sectors that would have been mentioned previously. So in which the CDB is I guess, providing contracts and works, or through the CDB, countries are providing works and contracts. So where we'd probably get a better sense as to what the activities are, what the focus is on, where the priorities are based on the individual sectors, as well as, what might be some of the key projects that might be imminent. So I'll encourage you to look out for that. We will send out the save the date later this week. And also, we should be in a position to share the presentations that were made a bit later on, either today, but certainly definitely before the end of this week. So thank you so much. I don't know if anyone from the CDB side wants to say any last words, then we'll close.
Michelle, I can come in quickly. Really just to thank you on our side. Thank you, first of all, to yourself for organizing, and again to all of the participants. And just to echo what you said, I'm hoping as many as possible can tune in to the next episode, if that's the right word, to learn a little bit more about some of the opportunities coming down the pipeline. Thank you again.
Okay, yes, so thanks again, everyone, and have a great rest of day. Take care.
Thanks.